Good evening and welcome. My name is Joseph Modica, and I serve as the University Chaplain here at Eastern University. And on behalf of President Matthews, I want to thank the Philadelphia Commons Institute for sponsoring this interfaith panel on values and voices. And I also want to welcome our distinguished panelists. We're grateful that you're here. Thank you for being here. You are welcomed here at Eastern University. I've been thinking about this panel conversation when Dr. Howard asked me to open with a prayer, and I thought it was especially a timely one. And of course, not just because of the midterm elections coming up, but because of the tragedy that occurred last Saturday at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. So to Rabbi Weiss, our condolences here from the university community. Actually, early tomorrow morning, and I mean early, 7 a.m. I leave with 4 students to actually visit a Reformed temple right outside of Boston, which is our annual Jewish-Christian interfaith exchange. And I'm looking forward to it, again, with our friends there and having students have an immersion experience. The prayer that I'll briefly offer this evening is from one of my heroes, Dr. Howard Thurman, an African-American author, theologian, civil rights activist who died in 1981. And he worked for nonviolence and started a multicultural church in 1944. He actually studied philosophy right down the road here at Haverford College. He's written 20 or more books, and the most famous being Jesus and the Disinherited. So let us now just take a moment to pray in the words of Dr. Howard Thurman. Lord, open unto me light for my darkness. Open unto me courage for my fear. Open unto me hope for my despair. Open unto me peace for my turmoil. Open unto me joy for my sorrow. Open unto me strength for my weaknesses. Open unto me wisdom for my confusion. Open unto me forgiveness for my sins. Open unto me love for my hates. Open unto me thyself for myself. Lord, Lord, open unto me. Amen.
Good evening and welcome. We are so delighted to see you tonight. We are the new Philadelphia Commons Institute. We were formerly called the Agora Institute, but we've rebranded, and I want to just quickly tell you a little bit about our rebrand. The Philadelphia Commons Institute honors our city and the very intentional way our founder, William Penn, brought about and thought about the common good. William Penn was a man of conviction. He suffered in prison for his beliefs, and then in a turn of history was given a parcel of land to settle the king's debt. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, became what he called the holy experiment. His 1701 Charter of Privileges ensured freedom of conscience, allowing people to freely and peaceably practice their faith. He also designed the city of Philadelphia with a center commons. You'll see this in our new logo that I'm very proud of. A center commons and 4 city parks or common green spaces in the corner. The idea was green space was peace. We at the Philadelphia Commons Institute affirm William Penn's legacy and want to be intellectual and dialogical green space. At a time when there's much division and anger and fear, we want to be a space where people can come together in social trust and an attitude of civic friendship to authentically share their views and respectfully listen to each other. Deliberative democracy, we say, requires face-to-face engagement. We care about the commons, we meet here as a community, and we care about the city of Philadelphia. Tonight's event perfectly exemplifies our reason for being. Speaking religious truth to political power, it seems all the more critical, as Chaplain Modica said, in light of the tragedy on Saturday at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. The very first right, again, secured by our First Amendment, before speech or the press or the right to peaceably assemble, is It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We do not all believe the same things, but we believe that we should be allowed to believe what we believe and to be able to worship freely. These letters, the letters of the American Values Religious Voices Project, speak to that truth. And tonight we have 4 letter writers here to read their letters and to speak briefly about them. So each of these folks up here have quite impressive biographies, and so I am just skimming the very surface. Excellent. Surface of it tonight. So please excuse me and please look them up. Rabbi Dr. Andrea Weiss is the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Provost and Associate Professor of Bible at Hebrew Union College and the Jewish Institute of Religion. Along with her many responsibilities in publishing record, she pulled this entire project together, reaching out and finding the 100 different religious voices from all over the country and all over the religious spectrum that comprise this book. Anand Zulfikar is Assistant Professor of Law at Rutgers Law School. He specializes in criminal law, Islamic law, and the law of war. He regularly provides expert media commentary for various outlets and is proficient in multiple languages. Murli Baljali is a diversity consultant and lecturer at the Annenberg School for Communication at Penn. While specializing in diversity and inclusion issues, he is also a journalist and served as the education director of the Hindu American Foundation. And finally, Ellen Ross is the Howard M. and Charles F. Jenkins Professor of Quakerism and Peace Studies. She specializes in Christian traditions with particular interest in Quaker studies, peace and conflict studies, gender studies, medieval religious life and thought, and contemporary religious thought. And just as a quick word, I'm teaching a class this semester called Justice and the Common Good. This week, we're reading the poetry of Emma Lazarus. She was a female Jewish poet who lived from 1849 to 1887. She received fame for her words that are on the Statue of Liberty, most famously, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." She wrote many poems explicitly discussing her Jewish identity and the condition of the Jewish people. One is called In Exile, another The Banner of the Jews. But in a very early poem, written when she was just 19, I think she has something for us tonight. She is writing a poem called Exaltation, about natural beauty of a June morning, but her final stanza is this: "The world is his who can behold it rightly, who hears the harmonies of unseen angels above the senseless outcry of the hour. The outcry of this hour is surely not senseless, but it can be all-consuming, and it can block the harmonies of unseen angels. The writers of these letters are able to speak truth, but in such a way that you still feel the peace, you still feel grounded in the truth, and you can still hear the harmony." I'm delighted to introduce the creator of this project, Rabbi Andrea Weiss.
I'm delighted to be here, honored to be here with the panelists to share this project with you. I thank Dr. Howard for inviting us. We met through a mutual friend and this past spring, and as she learned about my work and I learned about hers, it just seemed really a match. And as you talk about working for the common good and engaging dialogue face-to-face, that this event allows us to take a project that's all about dialogue, but on paper, and to be able to engage in that dialogue face-to-face. So I thank all of our panelists, for our letter writers, for coming, and it's great to actually meet people face-to-face, and to Chaplain Modica for welcoming us and framing the evening. So I'm going to share with you the story about how the American Values Religious Voices Project came about, and then we will hear from 3 of our letter writers, and they'll share their letters, and then we'll open it up for you and for dialogue face-to-face. This project started as a kind of harebrained idea that I had in the days following the election. And I'll give a little background. I live in Bala Cynwyd, even though I teach in New York. So unlike my colleagues in New York and my whole family's in California, I experienced the run-up to the 2016 presidential election with a lot of anxiety. And with a lot of concern, as I, like I'm sure many others, looked at what was happening during the campaign and in the days, even here in Philadelphia, in the days after the campaign, and really shaking my head and seeing that so many of the core American values that I had always taken for granted were all of a sudden seemed to be called into question or flagrantly overturned. And so that was something that I'd been thinking about a lot before and after the campaign. And my work is I teach Bible at a Jewish seminary in New York. I teach students who are studying to become rabbis, cantors, and Jewish educators. And in the Thursday, 2 days after the election, I teach a class called Teaching Bible to Adults. I was scheduled to teach a lesson on eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And very early on decided going to scrap that lesson, and my co-teacher and I said we were just going to share with our students the biblical texts that we were turning to that moment. And I said to my students that what they're doing in becoming clergy was all the more important in the wake of the election because people are going to need them more, and they need to know our religious texts so that they could share them, particularly when people in times of need, like on Saturday after the shooting in Pittsburgh, that when times of crisis, we really need our religious texts to comfort us, to provide us guidance, to provide us hope and insight. So those were some of the thoughts that were going on in my head, and I thought about some of our politicians, like our current vice president, who is quite explicit about coming to their work with a strong religious sensibility, and I couldn't understand how that squares up with the policies of the Trump administration, given Christian teachings. And so all of this came together, and while walking my dog in the days after the election, I thought, what if we could get a group of religious scholars together who could articulate what are our core American values, so many of which are connected to our religious traditions. So I came up with this idea, walking my dog, which is when I have most of my good ideas, that what if we could get 100 scholars of religion to write a letter a day to the president, vice president, members of Congress that would articulate what are our core American values that are connected to our religious tradition. And in some ways, I'm the last person to do this kind of project. I'm a Hebrew Bible scholar. I teach at a Jewish seminary. I went to the University of Pennsylvania, where I studied with Jewish professors and Jewish students. So I have a pretty limited worldview in terms of my scholarship, but I had this idea that maybe we could make it happen. So the first step was I walked down the street, and literally down the street from me lives Mark Smith, who's a Bible professor at Princeton Theological Seminary. He's a very senior Bible scholar. He's been a mentor to me from my days at Penn, and he watches all sporting events at my house. So we've good friends. And I knocked on his door, and I said, Mark, I had this idea. What do you think? And he said to me, I think it's a good idea, and I'll support it. So the next day or so, we had a big symposium at where I teach, Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. And I went up to our president, Rabbi Aaron Penkin, and I told him my idea. I said, I don't think it'll cost very much money. Meanwhile, I had no clue what it would cost. But I said, I don't think it'll cost that much. I think maybe I need a student intern to send the letters. And he said, let me think about it overnight. And he came back the next day and he said, okay, I'll support it. And he funded the project. Sadly, he passed away in May in a plane crash. And so this project is now dedicated in his memory. And the third person I reached out to is one of the first friends that I made 25 years ago when I moved to Philadelphia, and that's Lisa Weinberger, who's is a graphic designer who has her own firm called Masters Group Design in Philadelphia. And I sent her an email. You see, this is December 16th, so not long after the election, and I asked two things. One, if she would, you can see my dog is going to be a thread in this talk. So one is, would she take my dog for the weekend? Because I had recently learned, even though we're very old friends, I never knew what a dog lover she was. So would she walk my dog? And then I said I had this idea for this project. At the time I was thinking, I was tentatively calling it Scripture Teaches 100 Days, 100 Scholars of the Book. I told her the idea. You can see how long the email is, and this is what I get the next day. I'm in for both. And now, before this project, I wasn't on social media very intentionally, was not on Facebook or any other forms of social media. So I had no idea what I was asking Lisa. And I can now say, if I had known what I was asking Lisa, I never would have had the nerve to ask her. But she knew what the project would involve. But she, like many people, had a hole in her heart. And she thought, what could she do as a graphic designer that could contribute to the good in our society and to try to make our country a better place? And all of a sudden in her inbox lands my email asking her to be part of this project. And so she said yes right away. So a few days later, I was off to San Antonio. There's an annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature, American Academy of Religion. I had a little notebook with me, and every person I met, people I knew, people I didn't know, I started pitching my idea. What do you think, and who do you know? And I just started keeping lists of people that other people thought might want to contribute. I went to sessions that I wouldn't normally go to, like the African American Biblical Hermeneutics sessions, to hear papers, to try to hear what people outside of my more narrow world, who's speaking and who might want to be part of the project. And I left there with a pretty long list. And from that, reached out to form an advisory committee. I knew I would need a lot of help with this project. So my neighbor, Mark Smith, Deirdre Good is a New Testament scholar, and she had reached out to me on another project. So we met, and she said, I'll help whatever you need. Herbert Marbury is a scholar at Vanderbilt who I accosted at one of the African American Biblical Hermeneutics sessions, and I introduced myself, and I said, I'm doing this project. What do you think? Elsie Stern is the vice president and Bible scholar at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia. We are friends since we were 10th grade at summer camp. And then Hussein Rashid, who I just said to people, I need a Muslim scholar on my committee, and someone recommended him, and I sent him an email and said, do you want to be part of this? And he's been a great champion of the project. So with that, the Sunday after Thanksgiving, Elsie and I met at Lisa's house, and we said, okay, we need a better name. We came up with American Values, Religious Voices. Within days, Lisa had designed the whole design element, what was going to be she had a whole vision for the graphic identity for the project, and within days we had a Facebook page, Twitter account, and later Instagram, none of which I really knew what to do, so I got 2 student interns. And then we crafted a letter from the advisory committee, and we started sending them out. And so the first, in early December, we started sending them out. That gave us 50 days from then, 50 days from when we decided that we were going to go ahead with this to the inauguration, and we started sending out letters, and this was my very scientific way to keep track of things. I had lists, and I kept adding, I had this chart of names. I just kept getting more names, reaching out to people, and then as people would reply, I'm a pretty organized person, but this even stretched the limits of my organization, lists of who I sent letters to, list of who said yes, who said no, but this is the tally that I kept. And as we were hearing back from people, we started to create a presence on social media. This gives you a sense of some of the diversity of the participants. So we started, Lisa and her team at her design firm started creating artwork, and we started getting the word out about who was going to be involved in this project. And after 50 days and 180 invitations, we finally had our 100th letter writer on the day of the inauguration. So who are our 100 letter writers? I'm going to quote from Elsie Stern from Letter 100 in her letter as she looked back on the project. She wrote, "The American Values, Religious Voices letter writers provide a snapshot of the America that you have pledged to serve. We are men and women from red states and blue states. We identify as African American, Asian, Latinx, Native American, and white. We are Buddhists, Christians of varied denominations, Hindus, Jews, Muslims, and Sikhs. Some of our families have been in this country since before it was America. Others are immigrants ourselves." And when I first had the idea for the project, I thought, what if we could get these 100 scholars, and what if we could put all of those pictures, the pictures of these 100 people, on one page to really show this is what America looks like. And Lisa reached out to one of her colleagues who designed the beautiful website for us, and as part of the website, we have this graphic, which is the 100 pictures, and this still nearly brings me to tears. And I think this is a very powerful statement of really the glorious diversity of America, and this really is, I would argue, what America looks like and what makes us great. So a little bit about how the campaign operated. This is our website. We had a terrific website. Again, all the design work, the website was all pro bono. So at 5:30 a.m., note to self to not have it so early, that it was 5 a.m. No, excuse me, 5 a.m. So I was getting up at 4:50 for 100 days. At 5 a.m., we would have, the letter would go up on the website, and we had subscribers. So we had over 2,000 people who subscribed, and every morning very early, they got an email saying, day one, letter one, and who it was with the link. So that, and they went up on the website. At the same time, we had a MailChimp list. You can't just mail, what I found out is you can't just email, for example, Senator Toomey. So what I had to do is I bought a list of all the chiefs of staffs and legislative directors of every member of Congress. So that was a list of over 1,000 people. And every morning they would get a little email from me at 5 a.m. So the letter would get to them via email, the White House and members of Trump, the selected members of the Trump administration. We started before there was much of an administration. And then we would send, we would publicize the letters on social media. So we would put, we tweeted a quote. For every letter we had a tile with a quote. That we put on Twitter, and on Facebook we had a summary of the letter and the author's picture, and then we also had an Instagram account. Now, one of the things, if you see by the liked by, the first name is my son, then 13, who I could, and the next is my sister. So my family, like Lisa and I joked that at the beginning it was just our relatives who were following the campaign, but I could often tell when my son was up in the morning because I could see he was usually the first to like the Instagram photo. And at the same time, I printed the letters out on my, my printer at home. I printed 2 copies, one specifically addressed to President Trump, the other to Vice President Pence, and every morning my dog Sophie and I would mail the letters. So another part of the project was scheduling them. So the inauguration was on a Friday, so each week on a Thursday we would publicize the coming week. I tried to make the weeks diverse. I scheduled the letters a week at a time so that we could try to be as responsive as possible to the unfolding events. And that's pretty much how it worked. And now just quickly, because I want to leave plenty of time for the letters, a little bit of what the impact of the campaign and some of the other aspects of it. First of all, you'll see all the artwork throughout. That was all created by Lisa and her team. And from the minute that the website went up, people started emailing, texting me, and certainly once the letters started coming out. And every email I would get or text, I would pass on to my design partner, Lisa, because I wanted her to share the love. We were both working we were barely sleeping. We were working like crazy on this project. And so I wanted to make sure that she was seeing how well received the letters were. So I would send her the email with the feedback, and then she'd write me back and say, should I create art? And I said, Lisa, the answer to should I create art is always yes. And so they throughout the campaign, just both in response to feedback we got and her just being moved by the content of the letters, created all of this art that was unexpected and really terrific part of the campaign. So I'll just share a few of the piece of feedback that we got. You can also see visually what we did with that feedback, but that I think capture a lot of what the impact of the campaign. So this was it's actually an old college friend of mine who texted me early on to say, I'm loving my daily inspirational letters from voices I'm not accustomed to hearing. And I think that says a lot about why the campaign had the impact it had, because people were able to hear common themes from many different voices. I certainly learned a lot about other religious texts, religious traditions, and to be able to see the points of commonality in the letters. That was one of the fun things about scheduling them was, for example, around Valentine's Day, I noticed we had a bunch of letters that mentioned love. So I put a bunch of letters about love. Or President's Day, I put in all of my letters that I had that had to do with President's Day or other kind of themes. One, common good. So there's a string of letters that mentioned the common good. And to be able to see these same ideas talked about in different ways from different religious traditions. And then we also started receiving, my scholarly work is on metaphor, so I was really drawn to the number of emails, text messages that we got in which people were articulating what the project meant. And because for many people, this was the first thing that they were reading in those first 100 days. They would get up in the morning, and this was the first text or the first email in their inbox. And people really felt like in those 100 days that people would read them like a prayer. Someone else told me it was like their morning meditation, like a lifeline, an anchor. Someone who I work with said in one of the offices and in my work said to me, the letters made her feel like she wasn't alone, that there were other people who shared the kind of values that she shared. So the feedback I'm sure you're wondering, which is, did we hear from anyone in Washington? So we sent 100 letters. I heard from one person. So over 1,000 people we were sending them to in terms of all the chiefs of staff, the legislative director. Early on in February, so it was about day 25 of the campaign, it was an early morning, and I've got it in my inbox, a reply to the MailChimp account. So I know it's someone in Washington who's gotten the letters. And it was an email from Catherine McGuire, who's chief of staff for Republican Congressman Randy Holkren in Illinois. And she took issue with something the letter writer that day had written about using Lincoln's House Divided speech, and was talking about the need for unity. And then at the end of the letter, addressed his remarks specifically to President Trump. And she said, well, that last sentence or two seemed to go against the whole spirit of your letter when you're talking about we need to be united as a nation. And so I was thrilled to get her email. I sent it to the letter writer, and he wrote back and explained his thinking. And then she wrote back with the following quote: "Keep the letters coming. People are reading them. They helped to make sense of the world we live in today and remind us of the world we all want to live in tomorrow." And that really kept us going, and we did keep the letters going, not only during the 100 days, it was a crazy 100 days, and then, but even afterwards. So I'll just share briefly some of the what happened after the campaign. So you'll see this is from June. So the day 100 was April 29th. So at the end of May, I received an email from a woman. I'm a pastor of a Presbyterian church in Auburn, Alabama. Our religious school kids are reading the letters, and they want to know, did anyone write back? And I was so excited to get the email, first of all, that the kids were reading them even after the campaign. And I had gotten the almost identical letter from a class at a synagogue in Manhattan, where it was a group of seventh graders. They had a social justice curriculum, and they were reading the letters, and they in fact wrote their own letters. And so I sent a letter to my list, and the heading was "Kids Want to Know, Did you read your letters?" So no one wrote me back again, but that's an example how I've continued to try to engage in conversation. We've also continued to use the letters, the artwork, to be responsive to events that continue to unfold. So that summer, we had all of the attempts to sabotage the health care bill. There was withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords, Hurricane Harvey, any event in the world. Somehow I had a letter that I was able to respond to. So on Twitter, on Facebook, would respond using the letters. This was a Facebook post that we did with a compilation of quotes from the letters after the termination of DACA. This has Adnan's letter. This is when a year ago with the NFL protests, and I said, well, I have 3 letters about dissent, and so I put them together in a Facebook post. So we've continued to get the word out. A year after the campaign, I came up with the idea of the Values and Voices Presidential Primer. So starting 1 year after the start of the campaign, we tweeted a quote a day from the letters. And then the latest what's next from the project is the publication of this book, which just came out. And it really highlights in a beautiful way the letters and the values that are at the heart of the letters. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to turn it over to our letter writers to actually give you a sense of what these letters are all about and to share their letter and why they wrote what they wrote. You want to stand? You want to come?
I'll stand. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming out on a Thursday evening to listen to us share some of our thoughts and both on these letters and the project and sort of why we wrote what we wrote. I want to maximize as much time as possible for you all to engage us with your questions, but I did want to frame a little bit of kind of what my letter, or where it came about and what I was thinking. I come from the Islamic tradition. I'm Muslim, and so I realized that part of why I was being asked was as my voice as a Muslim. But I also realized, like all of us, that there are many parts of our individual tapestries, and that we draw wisdom from many different places. And so I wanted to make sure that my letter reflected all of that wisdom that I draw from different traditions, different people. So there are parts of the Bible in here, there are parts of the Quran and parts of the prophetic Muslim tradition. There are quotes from Tupac, there are quotes from Cesar Chavez. So there are a variety of things here. Why did I choose to speak on dissent? I think there were two primary reasons. I felt as though, one, as an American who has lived here and lived overseas as well, I always felt like it was a part of my American history that I took pride in a lot when I was overseas, in terms of the heroes that I grew up hearing about, the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, the Frederick Douglasses, etc., all these individuals who I felt represented this core American value. And then as someone who, both from the Muslim tradition, but from a religious tradition, I'd always viewed prophets as these dissenters within their societies. And so that was, I felt like, one of the more important values for me. So with that intro, I am going to read my letter. Dear Mr. President, Vice President Pence, members of the Trump administration, and the 115th Congress. American democracy relies on three branches to provide essential checks and balances: the judiciary, legislature, and executive. While there is no doubt that this separation of powers sustains our nation, it is our people who have consistently endeavored to correct our country's deepest flaws. We are the guardians of our most precious asset, dissent. Dissent is indigenous to this land. It precedes the founding of our union. Dissenting voices have rejected enslavement, marched for rights, protested injustice, and rallied against war. They have poignantly asked, "How hypocritical is liberty?" Tupac Shakur, and proclaimed, "Si se puede," Cesar Chavez. In theory, the legislature represents the popular will, but in essence, the people act as our fourth branch. In fact, these dissenting voices are part of a longer tradition of raising a mirror to those in power. Many religious traditions began with dissent, and from rejected stones, they became the new cornerstones. Psalms 118:22. In Islamic tradition, these voices offer nasiha, or sincere advice, towards a better path. They sing the melody of righteous opposition, crafted at the margins of society in pursuit of a more moral existence. In truth, they speak with a prophetic voice. As leaders of our nation, I urge you to listen to today's sages. Heed the counsel of the people. Know that their dissent is part of our collective story. Remember that history is not kind to obstinate leaders. Many a Pharaoh has neglected the Moses in their midst. This may mean following an unpopular path, one that may diverge from party, but not from conscience. The Quran reminds us that to stand for justice may require standing against oneself. To hear the people, you must walk the earth with humility. Recognize your limitations while endeavoring to fulfill your responsibilities. Listen most for the dissenting voices farthest away from the seats of power. Take care not to wrong them. Whether you hear them or not, the prayers of the oppressed are powerful. There is no barrier between them and God. Thank you.
Brother Adnan is a tough act to follow, so I'll do my best. And briefly, I'll frame the context as well. So I'm a Hindu, and whenever someone asks, well, what kind of Hindu are you? I usually respond, the regular kind. But I think from the larger scope of things, when we talk about interfaith action and dialogue, it's often framed within the Abrahamic context. And religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism have been a part of this country's social fabric, close to since its founding. And understanding that is key to understanding where our country is headed. As a tapestry, spiritual, ethnic, cultural demography of this country changes, we always have to be mindful of that. And so for me, the day after the election was really two things. One, appreciating that we don't appreciate what we have in terms of our freedoms, our ability to express ourselves until we're in danger of losing it. And secondly, for me, there were a lot of things that I didn't appreciate as a man, even as a man of color, even as a religious minority. But I was really inspired by my wife, Devi, who has had to deal with many more microaggressions than I've ever had to put up with. And so with that, when Andrea asked me to be a part of the project, and Hussein and I go back as well, I really wanted to frame my letter within that space. So my letter is, Dear President Trump, Vice President Pence, members of the Trump administration and 115th Congress, over the last few months, I've wondered what it means to have a divided country in which people are no longer willing to see themselves in others. We seem to be in a dark period where polarization, distrust, and animosity prevent us from progress towards a more perfect union. We continue to fight poverty, economic and social inequality, xenophobia, climate change, and a growing absence of empathy. All of these are daunting challenges at this particular moment in our history. The question I ask is, what can we do to create light together? Hindu scriptures are replete with stories and prayers that affirm that good and light always prevail, even if it takes more than one lifetime for many. That is why Hindu philosophy is predicated upon the idea that our universe exists in cycles. That is why we must never fall into the complacency of believing that our job in striving for good is complete. For many Hindus, the Ramayana is the ultimate allegory of going through darkness to return to the light. And the Ramayana, by the way, is one of the most popular Hindu epics, and interestingly enough, is the national epic of Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim country. So just to highlight the synchrony of culture and faith. In this ancient Sanskrit epic, Lord Rama returns from exile after defeating King Ravana, the metaphorical triumph of good over evil, with villagers celebrating his victory by lighting lamps. As we navigate through turbulence, we must remember that our society can emerge stronger out of the darkness. We must recognize that we are in this together and that the betterment of all requires more than safeguarding our own self-interests. I am strengthened by my faith's eternal optimism that our spiritual journey is ongoing, as is our work bettering American democracy together. I conclude this letter with the Pavana mantra, which embodies our desire for truth and light. Asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyoti gamaya, mityur mritam gamaya. Lead me from falsehood to truth. Lead me from darkness to light. Lead me from death to immortality. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here this evening. This is really a wonderful event to participate in. I have to say that I was just, myself, I have loved reading these letters. Oh. Thanks. I have loved reading these letters because it really is an affirmation of how religion draws people to act in the public, how it leads people to critique what's going on in the world around them and to be nourished and given energy to work to transform the world. So for me to be part of this was really, it was a difficult time for me when the political situation went as it did. And I really felt renewed and invigorated to be able to be with other people who were really thinking together about what we care about and how religion can be part of bringing that to be. And I was particularly thinking about prophetic voices in our own country and thinking that for some of us, it's really our connection to history and historical voices that really challenge us to act in the world. And I was feeling a lack of compassion. I was really looking for compassion. I was looking for compassionate action and compassionate speech on the part of our legislators. And then I was thinking, it's not just our legislators who are afflicted by a lack of compassion, it's all of us. And I was thinking about myself. And I was thinking about the banality of evil and how sometimes we're just so caught up in our own worlds that we don't remember compassion, and that compassion really has to be nourished. It has to be fed. It has to be nurtured in our lives. And I do a lot of work on 18th and 19th century Quakers who have been a very important part of the dissenting voices in our American culture. People who are always trying to speak for themselves, inspired by the life of Jesus, to try to call the world to be compassionate. So that's some of what I was thinking about as I wrote this letter. Dear President Trump, Vice President Pence, members of the Trump administration and the 115th Congress. As leaders of our nation, I imagine you seek to bring all Americans together to build a better future. Quaker voices offer insight to those of us working to achieve this goal. 18th century Quaker Anthony Benezet observed that humans have an inborn affinity for one another. Sharing a common humanity, we are all a part of one family. For Christians, the fundamental commandment that humans should love one another affirms this inborn affinity. Still, Benezet knew that if we turn away from one another, we live in constant danger of falling prey to what he regarded as the greatest calamity that can befall humans, hardness of heart. He pondered how we who regard ourselves as generous and humane could treat other humans cruelly without a feeling of great remorse. Now is the time to hear Benezet's challenge and to consider how we diminish ourselves when we act in repressive and warlike ways. When not only individuals but also nations grow gradually from bad to worse, they, at the same time, Benezet observed, become more and more hardened. As a result, Nations become, he said, reconciled to practices for which they had at first the utmost detestation and abhorrence. The preeminent 19th century American Quaker reformer Lucretia Mott, whose image will soon be on the $10 bill, noticed how often we silence our own awareness of the injustices surrounding us. I believe it is high time there was more moral courage, she wrote. As we are implicated in the harming of others, whether by our actions or by turning our eyes away from the suffering we perceive, we become increasingly alienated from ourselves and from the communities around us, more deeply mired in the sicknesses of the world. For Benazet and Mott, the antidote to hardness of heart is the cultivation of compassion. They urge us to listen to the still, small voice within. Tenacious and persevering, this voice reminds us of times when we have felt compassion for others. By remembering our common humanity, we sow the seeds of transformation and contribute to the realization of a better future for all people. Thank you.
So those three letters, I think, are a good example of the. Let me just get this back here. Are a good example of the diversity of religious traditions, just the number of religious sources that were quoted, also other authors. One of the things for the book, and one of the parts that I and a number of others spent a lot of time on the index. And it's so interesting just to look at, and I included in the index, all of these names, Tupac, Lucretia Mott, just so you could go through and see just the diversity of people that are quoted. Even, there's only one letter that in some cases that mentioned, but so you could see the wide variety of sources that are being brought together, and so beautifully these messages and the values that are articulated. So we want to open it up now to your questions, comments, to any of us, and be able to go engage in dialogue face to face with you as well.
I guess this question is for the panel entirely, but anyone who has a particularly strong reaction, feel free. How would you respond to the suggestion that you are cherry-picking aspects of the originating documents or the originating texts of your religion to suit your view, just as the current administration selects which aspects of the text that they want to highlight?
We're all indifference.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all religious believers cherry pick what they want, and I think part of that is done as they navigate most of the time old religious tradition in a new modern context. And as new things arise and as they sort of balance what in Islamic tradition is your fitrah, your sort of moral conscience, and as that is sort of nurtured and changed with modern times to some degree, and you still want relevance to your religious tradition. So I think, I agree that I think that we do very much the same things that, other people who disagree with us or who may be on a different side of the spectrum than us do with the religious tradition. And I think one of the helpful things that I've found is to be in conversation with them at different points, whether within your tradition or outside of it, to see maybe there are insights that they have about certain segments of your tradition that you never saw, and maybe there are things that you see that they haven't seen. So I think that's the nature of sort of religious tradition in general, in my view.
I would agree. I think throughout history, theology and interpretation of Scripture has intersected with the norms and the applicable cultures of those times. And how we interpret our scriptures or theologies is clearly influenced and intersected by our own backgrounds, our own experiences, and how we choose to live our lives based on the ideals we interpret in our scriptures. I think one of the compelling ideas is how interpretation of scriptures can come on opposing sides of social movements. Howard Thurman's interpretation of the Bible in terms of Black liberation theology clashed with Bob Jones' ardent defense of segregation using the same scriptures. So in the same regard, my interpretation of Hindu scriptures may come into opposition with someone who interprets those scriptures differently. So I think that diversity of views is also important, and we all select aspects of scriptural texts that apply to us or we agree with.
And I think this project invites the conversation. It really invites us to think about what motivates us in life, what calls us to action in the world, what traditions and scriptures and stories and people invigorate us. And it calls us to have the conversation, and where there's disagreement, to talk about it. It's remarkable to me, reading through the letters, the common themes. One of the things I loved about this project is it really invited us, and we could really do with it what we wanted, but some of us just, it really celebrated our own particularity in what we were writing. And then what was interesting is when we started to read across the letters, there were some remarkable themes that went across religious traditions. I noticed prophetic language, prophetic traditions just came up again and again in letters. The importance of hospitality, caring for strangers, across religious traditions, love, justice, the importance of rulers and leaders caring for people, the listening sacred. There were themes that it was remarkable consonance of a set of themes that went across traditions. It was really beautiful to see. And but it invites conversation.
Right, and you can see in the book, we have this 4-page spread where we've highlighted those values. And so I think there too, there is clear consensus about certain scriptural values. So for example, and some of these are so the letters where we had the most letters on a certain topic, justice was the most. And that is a reflection both of what is emphasized in our different religious traditions, but also what is American. So justice, but if you look the other, so freedom, but on you'll see there's also the second highest on the stranger. So that which both reflects what's going on in our country, but also that is such a core theme in different religious traditions, is to have compassion for the stranger. So people are picking, but there are also clearly certain bedrock themes in biblical scripture, in different religious texts, and those came out. And people also chose what was responsive to the moment too. So there's the connection there, both where's the intersection between what's our religious traditions and American values. So it's places where like justice, compassion, those points of intersection, that's, I think people picked texts that landed at that place. Other questions? Yes?
What specifically, if you could give me like an example, about the Trump administration called you to action, specifically about the Trump administration that wasn't relevant in administrations past? Or I guess I'm trying to figure out how to word this. But what about the Trump administration called you to action?
Why now? I think that's a great question. Whoever, dive in.
I think it was, as Andrea had started, the divisive nature of the campaign itself. A situation where the very fabric of our country was being torn apart rhetorically. And, for a number of us, seeing people that we considered neighbors, regardless of their political or religious beliefs, turn skeptical of one another. And this is not just, a figment of our imaginations, actually happening, right? And I think what all of us, I think, were bound by was this, I think, common duty to maybe repatch the country, try to move forward in a way where we may not agree politically, but we do have common values that call us to action. And, nearly 2 years after the election, we still exist in a highly polarized time that's not getting any closer to bringing us together. So I think all of us felt our diversity of views could at least help advance the conversation of our common humanity. So,
for my part, I would have sent the same letter to President Obama. I think that there is a tenor that can't be denied in terms of sort of the rhetoric with this administration, which has potentially gone against norms of prior administrations. But in terms of the content of my letter, and if you wanted to change that first line and just say, Dear President Obama, I would have sent the same letter. And actually, my letter is distinct from the other letters in the book because
Did you talk about that?
I don't address it to President Trump. I just say, Dear Mr. President. So that's.
Oh, yeah, this is an older version. In the actual letter in the book says, Dear Mr. President. Anyone else want to?
Did you have a follow-up to that? And then I'll
Just to follow up, when you said the split of the nation on both sides and how neighbors felt like you saw a distrustfulness in people with one another and with their neighbors, do you believe any of that could be related to like a lack of education on the topics politically, or influence, or just a lack of seeing another perspective, instead of just like the Trump administration itself diversifying the country?
I think this country has been slowly moving towards polarization for years. I think the 2016 election was just a manifestation of years of splits, not just across ethnic and religious line, but geography as well. And we're seeing that manifest itself in different ways even now. So I think there's a lot of complex factors that led to where we are, but as I think Adnan said, there's always a period of polarization before and after an election. It's just that I think the rhetoric has exacerbated that feeling of division and that feeling that some conversations are beyond reconciliation. So.
And I would echo that I feel as if this was a moment when we were being invited for people who might be feeling we could just continue to divide and separation and isolation. We could just go off into separation and isolation, which we could always have done. I think in the whole history of America, the people that I write about from the 18th and 19th century were really concerned about what was happening in their time. And so there have always been people who are concerned about what's happening in their time. And it seems as if this is a moment when many people are articulating that they feel division and divisiveness. And so it becomes all the more important as a moment to say, we're not going to do that. We're not going to stop the conversation. Even as we're feeling more anxious about it, we're feeling more concerned about it, we're feeling more divided and isolated and separated from one another. We will not do that. We will try to talk. And I really feel that this book was an attempt to say, let's keep talking to one another. Let's not give up on thinking that we really can listen and speak to one another.
And also to show that even we may be different political parties, you may have different feelings about different political issues, but these are core values. That love, empathy, pluralism. That these values that we share, even if we may vote differently, we may go to a different house of worship, but that we have commonalities, and to try to also
Yeah.
both celebrate the diversity, but also create points of connection too.
And that's what was really important to me about this project was the values, because often we can find that though we may differ on lots of issues, if we can articulate values that we hold in common, that then we can actually begin to work together. Though we may have lots of other differences, when we are working with common values, sometimes that becomes a way forward.
Yeah.
First off, thank you. What a great, amazing project you've all undertaken. Thanks for each of the letters read. Really amazing stuff. On the point of the values that you're showing, I wondered if you had similarly ones on open-mindedness, civility, and unity, things I see you all sort of being expressed to us now, and I'm wondering if it's in the book. And then just to follow up to that, how many people feel after they've kind of heard what you've done, feel a shift in their own positions from whatever party to recognize that there's an idea, there's a call here, an inherent call for unity and open-mindedness and civility that this book is actually kind of promoting, and have you seen or heard anything along those lines?
Well, two good questions. Let me address the first question, a little bit about the index. So if you go onto our website, which you can still get on, when I uploaded the letters, I would tab them for certain themes or values. And that's partly how we got to this list. So, and we did that so that users could put the letters in conversation. So if you click on love, you'll get the letters, and so you may have, or let's say compassion. So Ellen's letter, you may get a Jewish scholar writing a compassion and bringing in Jewish sources, a Muslim. You can hear different voices on the same theme. So that's what this started on the website of tagging them. And they were both, we sort of loosely kind of values, but also topics. And then when we started working on the book, so we wanted, and my design partner came up with this idea of showing the values this way. And so we wanted to have 20. And so I had been keeping a list. So I went from the website, and I also, I had a student who was working with me too. This is very editorial. First of all, we had, how do you count? So empathy, for example, does a letter actually have to use the word empathy? Or is it, it talks about it but doesn't use the word? If you're talking about how many letters are on freedom, what if the word uses liberty but not free? So there was sort of some negotiation. I had a list, and then she had a list, and just to get everything on the page, we had a lot of conversations back and forth. So to which values did we want to highlight? We tried to do the one, it wasn't so simple to count them, but this is sort of a rough estimate, at least to kind of both to visually show what were the values that rose to the surface. In some cases, we had to figure out as democracy. We decided it wasn't a value, it was a topic. So there's a lot of stuff that's in the table, that's in the index in the back that you can find, put letters in, that we still wanted in the book for people to be able to put letters in conversation around themes. So that was how we ended up with this piece as a way to put things in conversation. In terms of the second question, which is a little bit of sort of impact, I don't know if anyone, my response is the book literally just came out, so I'm hoping that we'll have more opportunities to engage in dialogue in this way. I hope the book should be successful and be able to, engage more, get people talking about these values. So, my answer is a little bit we'll see, but I don't know if anyone else has a sort of response, another response to that, either question.
Well, to me, the fact that it's there is just making real that a conversation is happening.
So the individual letters, just as a follow-up, the individual letters that you were using on the website with the blogs, they didn't did you get, apart from the one person coming back to you from the chief of staff, did you get some real conversations going with people who you thought, oh wow, we're actually changing the larger conversation of the narrative in that person's mind?
So I do know, so a little bit about how the letters were used in real time during the campaign. So one with Dr. Howard, our show. So when I had the idea for the book, it's not only the book includes not only the letters but a number of essays. So I wrote an essay about the campaign, Lisa about the design element. I asked all the letter writers about a year later to write back anyone who wanted to share their thoughts about what the impact was. So we have this, I called it the author's postscript, kind of the PS to the letters where authors reflect back a year later. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be great to get someone who is outside of the project, looking in, and particularly it'd be great to have someone who was a political scientist. And lo and behold, in May, just as we're starting to put the book together, I get an email totally out of the blue from Dr. Howard, and not only is she a political scientist, but she was teaching at the time of the project, she was teaching a class at St. Joseph's University on religion and politics. My rabbi told her, or a mutual friend told her about the project, and she assigned the letters to her students. And so you'll see she has an essay, and her essay is both her own experience using the letters in her college class, in her religion and politics class, combined with broader insights as a political scientist. And also I gave her this large document I have with all the feedback that we got throughout the campaign, every piece, people's emails, my response, and said, you look at this and tell me what, I analyze it. And so her essay is also analyzing the feedback. How did people respond? That's getting a little bit, so we know that's an example of how the letters were used. I mentioned the religious school kids. We know that they were used in religious school. People were using them, clergy, other people, for interfaith dialogue during the time of the campaign. I know of clergy who used them at the start of services. So they were in real time, in a more public kind of way, besides just people reading them in their email every day or sharing them on social media, that they were also used in religious settings and interfaith settings. So other questions?
Yeah, I just want to echo the commendation for this project. It's just really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I guess this sort of, maybe I'll have to read the responses that you got. It strikes me that you are modeling a kind of empathy and dialogue, which is wonderful. In some ways, a religion can have a bad PR problem in that it's not associated with dialogue and open-mindedness and a sort of more ecumenical perspective on these issues. So I just wondered if you had any pushback in the sense of, well, this isn't the way to try and bring us together, or maybe even with younger people who identify as spiritual but not religious, that they would say, well, religion shouldn't be in politics and we should sort of separate these kinds of issues. I just wondered if there was any feedback, that sort of said maybe religion isn't the way to bring us together.
Well, we did get one email from someone who said, I'm an atheist, but that doesn't make me blind to good words and good advice, and that she was following the campaign. So that's sort of the closest to your comments. I mean, I think for a lot of people who wouldn't consider themselves so religious, and I'm here speaking about feedback I got from some of my own siblings or good friends, who were just so moved to see these ancient religious texts that were so spot on to the issues of the day, and we're very moved by that. It's one thing for those of us who teach religion, who are religiously engaged ourselves, but I think for a lot of other people who were looking at these with fresh eyes and thinking how relevant, whether it's an 18th century Quaker thinker or a passage from the Quran or a Hindu or Sikh text, wow, so relevant to this moment. So I think it was more of that kind of a response, an appreciation for what religious texts could offer. Other questions?
I think that's part of the importance of a work like this as well. I find a lot of young people that I work with think of religion as being associated with division and violence, and that's really changed, I think, in recent years, but a lot of young people feel this way. And I think this project says, and there are traditions, yes, religion is involved with all those things, and also religion is involved with traditions of healing and making connections and bringing people together. But I think it is a conversation to have, because I think there are lots of people who don't think that religion belongs in politics. And then we can all talk about lots and lots of traditions that it's actually people's religious convictions that led them to change the world in really positive ways. And people often now overlook that. They don't take seriously people's religious convictions. We look a lot of the positive changes in this country, people were motivated by their religion to risk their lives for things that they've done. So I think remembering the stories invites the conversation. And some people still may say religion has no place in politics. And I think we should be talking about it.
And I think that there's a conflation, a misconflation between one's religiosity and spirituality and dogmatism. I think if you are dogmatic, and this is dogmatic whether you're religious or don't have any religious identification, that dogmatism can sometimes keep you from being able to engage. And, you know, I think I've always approached these conversations around if you can enter a situation with open eyes, open ears, an open mind, and an open heart, there's always room to grow that dialogue, even if you end up agreeing to disagree.
I think for me, as I kind of preface my remarks as well, I think religions are just wells of wisdom along with other wells out there. And so, for instance, you don't have to be a hip-hop aficionado or even like music to find wisdom in words that someone like Tupac Shakur wrote. And I think similarly with regard to religious tradition, you know, I don't need to be Hindu to be inspired by Hindu texts, right? Or I don't need to be an atheist to find inspiration in someone who is atheist and has insights on the world. So I think in some respects, the book is just a collection of these wells of wisdom that happen to be from religious traditions that oftentimes in our society, you know, we associate with that dogmatism, so we don't want to touch any type of wisdom that may be there. And that partly is a fault of religious believers at times, and then sometimes is just a reaction from others. So hopefully this opens up the view on that.
We have a nice quote that actually ends Dr. Howard's essay from an email we received. It says, talking about the project, it brings me living waters of sustenance and courage from deep ancient wells. So echoing here. Yeah. No, yeah.
I was just wondering about your selection of the people for these 100 letters. Are most of them from academic settings? Do you have people that are pastors or rabbis or priests or whatever, you know?
So the organizing principle here, that they were all scholars. That was, part of my original idea. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a rabbi and also a Bible scholar. And she said, like, I don't really care what, my Bible colleagues have to say. I'm more interested, what a rabbi or minister. I said, those people have a very public platform. And I felt like, particularly scholars of religion and scholars in general, but are not people, like, these are voices that are not generally part of the larger conversation. And I felt like, particularly scholars of sacred scripture had something to say this is my hunch, was something to say at this particular moment, and that we really needed to hear from those who really knew our sacred texts, knew them well, and could articulate what the messages that they have to say and how they connect to us as Americans and at this particular moment. And scholars get asked to do a lot of things. You'll get regularly, in your inbox, will you write this encyclopedia article, this chapter for a book, and you get asked a lot of things. And this was, I figured, 350 words. I thought it would be therapeutic or kind of cathartic for people to feel like you could write something. The questions that we ask people at the beginning is what text from your tradition are you thinking of at this particular moment? What do you want to share with people right now? Every letter, we ask people to ground it in some kind of a text, a textual source to make that connection. And that was sort of the hunch that people like us who spend academics and do our day-to-day work in these ancient sacred texts that had something to say at this moment. I think that's one of the pieces that I'm proud about was that it gave, and scholars of all, we have a really range of scholars, from some of the most distinguished scholars to young scholars who are new, and just a wide range of different voices. So it allowed people to have a very wide audience for their thoughts. One more question? Yeah.
I'm wondering, I have a question, I guess, about communication strategy. I'm a writer, and I try really hard in my writing to persuade people. And I guess in the last few years, calling up my members of Congress many times and asking them to, support or not support certain legislation, I have felt the need to, for those members of Congress who disagree with me, I have felt the need to come up with reasons that would be persuasive to them, even if I don't necessarily care about that as much. I'm looking for ways to motivate them to do what I think is the right thing to do. But I also wonder at the same time how much, I don't know how persuasive I'm going to be, so is it even worth speaking sometimes? I know it is, but I'm wondering if you all could speak about how you wrestle with that, how you seek to persuade people who differ in opinion from you, whether it's worth speaking up even when you kind of know that you're not going to change their mind, and just how you make decisions about that.
So I have somewhat of a unique perspective on this because in another life I worked in the U.S. Senate for a senator from Georgia, and so spent a number of years kind of hearing from constituents and hearing and speaking to the senator and sort of being in his ear about things. So with regard to the latter part, you absolutely should always voice your opinion. You would be shocked at how much that ends up mattering, particularly when it's not just you, but 10 other people who have the same thought, should I really say anything? And they all decide, yeah, I should. And suddenly you have 10 emails or 10 letters. And we literally kept count, right, of an issue. How many letters are we getting in? How many phone calls? Because at the end of the day, I think our politicians, as much as we want them to be prophets, if you will, or people who will do the moral thing, their interpretation of what the right thing to do is what their constituents think the right thing to do is, right? It's a very clean sort of, for the most part. There's some issues that they're really gung-ho about, but for the most part, they really care and want to know what their constituents think the right thing to do is. So if you express that, I think there's always voice that. Will they always listen? Are they always going to hear you? No. There are going to be other people who are similarly in their ear and trying, particularly politicians who may be on the other side of the spectrum from you, who may have other constituents that they're listening to. But you would be surprised, and I witnessed on many occasions where it sways them and where they feel sort of that energy from their population. And, one voice oftentimes is amplified by many other one voices that have decided to speak up. So
I think if your outcome is persuading, you'll often end up disappointed. But and I'm framing that only from the standpoint that there's a verse in the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna tells Arjuna, act without attachment to the fruit of your action. In other words, if you act expecting things, that's not the purpose of acting, right? So all we can do is say our piece, do our best, regardless of the outcome. And I know that the results may not always be what we want them to be, but it's better than to act than stay on the sidelines. And I think that ultimately is what motivates us. And I think all of us share that common desire to act, right? And it wasn't about, okay, well, we're going to get all 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate and the various delegates and non-voting members to respond. It was more of, what are we doing in concert, united by these common values, different faiths and common values, to act, right? And not just stay on the sidelines.
I really agree with you. And I feel the poignancy of what you're expressing. And I think in the face of it, all we can do is just keep doing what we're doing and realize, yeah, we can't predict what the outcome will be, but being present for the conversation, that is something we can do.
Yeah, and I'll end with a quote that we have on the website, and it was part of when we sent the letter from the advisory committee asking people to be involved in the project. We said, individually, it's hard to feel that one can have an impact on events unfolding around us. Collectively, we have the potential to speak truthfully and powerfully to those making critical decisions about our nation's future, and that's part of what it was. So just joining together to have a collective voice. Thank you. Raymond.
Please join me again in thanking this wonderful panel. I just want to say, so my husband is Penn's chaplain, and I teach political science, and right, Emily Post said never talk about religion or politics when you're at a nice dinner because you might shake people up, right? And that's what we are, and that's what this project did. And there are ways in which, especially, I mean, it's not just the election of 2016. It's a confluence of many things, right? We are social media age. There's a wonderful book by Cass Sunstein called The #Republic, Democracy in the Digital Age, where you silo ourselves by algorithms all the time, right? But what I want to encourage all of you, what we did tonight, face-to-face discussion with people that are outside of your silo, whether it's your silo is religiously made or your silo is politically made. It's safe when you're in a safe space, and we really want to make this space a safe space. So we have books on sale at the table over there. We also have journals. We'll also be around for a little bit. We'd love you to stay a little bit and talk. But can we just one more time thank our panel?